Hare Krishna, and welcome to this week's virtual Sunday feast here at ISKCON Chicago, the home of Sri Sri Kishore Kishori. And on behalf of Srila Prabhupada, a big welcome. Thank you all for joining. Before turning it over to the Nrsimha prayers and tonight's speakers, Grace Ujjvala Prabhu, a few very exciting announcements. The first is, I just received word that the temple will be reopening for limited darshan, so limited hours, Saturdays and Sundays only, from 4:30 p.m. until 6:30 p.m. So that's starting this coming Saturday. That is Saturday, February 27th, and Sunday, February 28th, will mark the first 2 days of the temple being open for regular darshan. And just wanting to stress that this is just darshan. This is not for the regular Sunday feast program. We will continue to remain online indefinitely. This is just for darshan of the deities in the main temple room. And again, that starts this Saturday, February 27th. Hours are 4:30 p.m. until 6:30 p.m. So that's really exciting news, and I'm happy to share that with all of you here. The other is this Thursday, we will be celebrating Nityananda Trayodashi. So there are two things to remember with this Thursday's Nityananda Trayodashi festival. The first is there will also be darshan in the temple from 4:30 until 6:30 p.m. But for the Nityananda Trayodashi, the Thursday darshan, you will need to register through the ISKCON Chicago website. So there's a special page set up for those of you that would wish to be at the temple in person for reserved time slots. So make sure to get your name there so that you can get your time booked to make sure that you're able to attend in person. And that's this Thursday. There will not be a formal festival in person, just the opportunity to be at the temple at your reserved time. To clarify, on Saturdays and Sundays, starting this coming weekend, you do not need to make a reservation. Reservations are only required on Nityananda Trayodashi this Thursday and any other special holidays and festivals as will be communicated in the future. So that's very exciting. And then we'll also have a virtual festival, so a talk that will be Thursday starting at 6:30 p.m. More information, as well as a reiteration of what I've just shared, will be sent through the temple email. If you're not currently receiving the weekly updates from ISKCON Chicago, send a message through Zoom or on YouTube, and I'm happy to get you added. Make sure to include your email address. And then I'll turn it over now to tonight's lead singer of the Nrsimha prayers, Gopinath, also backed by Sri Jiva. So thank you so much for taking on this service. And thank you, Radhakund Mataji, for encouraging your students and allowing them to be able to assist in the Sunday Feast program through this service. Thank you so much, Hare Krishna. Now we'll turn it over to tonight's speaker, His Grace Ujjvala Prabhu. Many of us may be familiar with him. For a while, he was a resident of the sanctuary, and for those of you that were fortunate enough, he is also an amazing, extremely empowered chef and kirtaniya. So some of his many, many, many talents. So I'm very grateful to Ujjvala Prabhu for taking the time to join us here from Ypsilanti in Michigan to continue this Brilliant as the Sun series. And he's titled tonight's discussion called A Vision of the Infinite. And this is going to be based on 3rd Canto, 8th chapter of the Srimad Bhagavatam. Hare Krishna.
Hari Hari, thank you so much, Prabhu. It's really, it's a little bit humbling to sit here and speak in front of the Chicago community. I am a bit of an introvert, so I don't generally tend to reach out to too many people, but I always really appreciated how expansive and also kind of the tight-knit groups that I saw in Chicago as far as the Sangha there. And I always appreciated the kind of lack of a political way of being amongst the devotees there. I found it quite refreshing when I stayed at the temple there that the devotees were very simple, but in the best kinds of ways, not in any kind of, disparaging way, but just in a very, very nice and sweet way. I found all the devotees in Chicago to be, quite simple-hearted. And so it's very nice to sit here. And as I said, a little humbling to speak. So I really appreciate you inviting me. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak on Srimad Bhagavatam. And yeah, thank you. So we'll do a little Mangalacharna, and then we'll see where we go. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Udirayat Nashtapraeshu Bhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttama Shloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtiki Paramananda Pathaya Prema Varshaksharayate Sarvada Sarva Sevyaya Shri Krishnaya Namostume Om Jnanatimidandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Mena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kada Mahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yutapada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakan Vitangsha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dheena Bando Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Rishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Shrimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Mukam Karoti Vachalam Pangum Langayate Girim Yat Kripam Tamaham Vande Shri Gurum Dinataranam Yam Pravrajantam Anupetam Apeta Krityam Tvaipayano Viraha Katara Ajuhavas Putreti Tanmayataya Taravo Binedus Tam Sarvabhuta Hridayam Munimanatosmi. So today we're covering the eighth the eighth chapter of the 3rd canto, And I'd just like to do a little bit of a wind up on the way to the 8th chapter so that we get a little bit of a feel for where we are. So the 3rd canto in general is assigned by Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur as mainly dealing with the primary creation, or what we call sarga in the 10 topics of the Bhagavatam. And while no canto is exclusively dedicated to any one particular topic, they all contain different ones, or most of them to some degree or other. He says this one largely deals with sarga. Therefore, it's a very technical chapter, and a lot of it is dealing with some nitty-gritty details that a lot of us may wonder as to why they're so important or necessary for us to know. So as we move forward, I want to touch on that and touch a little bit on what the actual importance is of hearing these things and what utility they have in our lives. So I'll just start with the story that the kind of narrative that we're weaving through on our way through the canto. The canto opens up with Vidura going on pilgrimage, being cast out by Dhritarashtra, more so by Duryodhan. Dhritarashtra is he's got a good heart, but he's got really bad association. And so he always makes the wrong decisions. So Vidura is cast out because he's trying to give Dhritarashtra good advice. And so he goes on pilgrimage. And after that pilgrimage, while he's on that pilgrimage, all of the exploits of the Battle of Kurukshetra and all of the political intrigue that goes on between the Kurus and the Pandavas takes place. And most of the people in that story leave. Krishna leaves, everybody leaves the planet. So after Vidura's pilgrimage, he runs into Uddhava. And when he runs into Uddhava, the first thing that he asks is, how is Krishna doing? And then he asks how all of the other associates of Krishna are doing, particularly the ones in Dwarka and the ones in Hastinapur and the ones, basically the Pandavas and all of their relatives. So this sends Uddhava into a great trance because he's heard about Krishna and also because he's in the throes of separation, because little does Vidura know, Uddhava has just been with Krishna at the time of his leaving the planet. He's just heard the Uddhava Gita, which is narrated in the 11th canto. And so Uddhava, it's described, he sits down in meditation for nearly an hour because he's overwhelmed by these emotions that are brought about by Vidura's questions. And after that hour, he begins to speak out of pure ecstasy. He narrates the pastimes of Krishna in Vraj. He narrates the pastimes of Krishna in Mathura and Dwarka. And after seeing this display, this ecstatic display of Uddhava, Vidura naturally tries to take shelter of him as his spiritual master. But Uddhava is very young. And so Uddhava, he says, this is not so proper. You're nearly, you could be my guru or my grand guru, just going by the temporal sense of things. And he says, I understand because you know I was there with Krishna when he left, and I've told you about these instructions that he gave me. But if you want to hear the rest of them, and for this to be proper, you should hear from Maitreya, because Maitreya was also there. And so Uddhava then refers Vidura to go and meet Maitreya Muni, who is on the bank of the Ganga. So Vidura makes the trek to the Ganga, and he finds Maitreya. And he tells Maitreya about Uddhava's kind of reference. And so Maitreya says, okay, yes, I was there. I'll speak to you. And then Vidura begins to ask Maitreya questions. This opens up a section of the Bhagavatam that runs nearly until the 5th canto. Maybe it even goes into the 5th canto. So the bulk, the next 80 or so chapters of the Bhagavatam are this conversation between Vidura and Maitreya. So Vidura opens up with questions about the universe and the nature of the universe, which is where it starts to get really technical. Before that, the beginning of the canto, again, it's basically a summarization of the 10th canto. So it's very easy reading, so to speak. But now we get into some of the nitty-gritty philosophical details of our philosophy as they pertain to the way the universe unfolds, the nature of the universe, the nature of Maya, the nature of Bhagavan. And so these things are easy to gloss over. So in chapter 5 and 6, we largely hear a description of the unfolding of the universe in its primary sense. And one thing I want to just kind of briefly touch on, which we'll come back to, is why this is necessary. Why is it necessary for us to hear such technical things and things that frankly are just going to go over our head, or things that we're not even really going to think about in our bhajan, as our bhajan is, laid out to us and described. We're supposed to think about Krishna, think about the holy name, think about pastimes. We're supposed to become absorbed, but it's not necessarily that I'm going to chant my japa and I'm going to meditate on earth coming out of the water element, and water coming out of the fire element, and the gradual unfolding of the material elements. But there's a little aphorism that's in the Vedanta Sutra that is tattu samanvayat. And this is a very, very powerful little 3-word phrase that if we explore this, it can really help to plant an understanding of why it's important to at least gain a cursory understanding of these things. We may not need to become a scholar and be able to quote these things verbatim and know them like the back of our hand, but we should know them enough that we can kind of form a worldview around them. So what this phrase means, tattu samanvayat, is that there should be samanvaya amongst all of the statements of the Vedas. For a proper worldview, for a proper understanding of Vedanta, proper understanding of the philosophy of existence and of reality, there should be a complete agreement, not only amongst the books, not only amongst the paragraphs, not only amongst the sentences, but amongst every word of the Vedic literature. If you don't have that, then you don't have a complete understanding of the absolute truth. This is what Vyasadeva has said by saying this tattu samanvayat, that there is no standard lower than complete harmony amongst every single statement of the Vedas. Otherwise, your darshan, or your view of that world, of the world that we're looking at, and of it as it's described through the Vedas, is deficient. So the Bhagavatam offers us this, because the Bhagavatam is a natural commentary on the Vedanta Sutra. It's a natural commentary on the essence of the Upanishads. And by understanding, at least, as I said, on a cursory level, the things that are taught to us through the Bhagavatam, then we actually gain access to something very revolutionary. We gain access to a worldview which is completely harmonious to the actual nature of reality. We gain access to a worldview which is going to allow us to move through the world in the most efficient way possible, and eventually move above the world, because we're trying to go beyond this world. That's what we're trying to do as spiritual practitioners. We're trying to even, it's so interesting because the Bhagavatam even says that moving beyond this world isn't even the goal of a devotee. It's simply a secondary byproduct of the actual thing, of bhakti yoga. So this understanding of samanvaya, of the full perspective that's granted by the teachings of the Bhagavatam, if we understand what it is, then we can actually become attracted to it and desire to inculcate it in our lives. Now, why would we even want to do that? That's the question there, because it seems like a lot of work, and it seems like I could just sit down and chant, or I could sit down and do some. Many times we hear that intellectual pursuit is something that's meant for some people and not for all people, that some devotees will be attracted to the Shastra, and some devotees will be attracted to Kirtan, and some devotees will be attracted to serving the deity, and this is all fine and good, and everybody can pick what they would like to pick. But actually, what our acharyas explain, and what Srila Prabhupada continually hammers on whenever the 9 processes of devotional service come up, is that Shravanam is the most important thing, that hearing is the most important of the limbs of bhakti, because all of the other limbs of bhakti derive their power, or rather the limbs don't derive their power, but we derive our ability to become absorbed in the other limbs of bhakti by the power of our understanding of what bhakti is, of what those limbs are. Because actually, people don't often like to hear this or like to think about it, but we're all philosophical beings. Every person in this chat, every person in this world, so to speak, every person in Chicago, every person in Michigan, every person everywhere is a philosophical being. What does that mean? That means that we only do things that make sense to us. They may not make sense on the grandest scale because we're using bad philosophy. But at the end of the day, we only do things that we have a reason to do. Anything other than that is insanity. And so what that shows us and tells us is that what we require is an understanding of why things are important, of why we should be doing things. This is why Shravanam is so important and why it's actually labeled by our acharyas as being the first place that one gets taste in devotional service. Having a conceptual understanding of what bhakti is, of who Krishna is, of who I am, of what this world is, that allows one to then actually start moving in that direction, because we can only go for something that we value. If we don't value something, we have no reason to try to attain it. And if we don't understand what something is, we cannot value it. Therefore, Sambandha Tattva and Prayojan Tattva, the understanding of the foundational truths and of the goal, are completely integral for there to be abhideya, for there to be actual bhajan. Therefore, when Sri Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur breaks down these 9 steps of Rupa Goswami, Shraddha, Sadhu Sangha, etc., he breaks Sadhu Sangha and Bhajana Kriya into 3 stages actually. He says Sadhu Sangha means Guru Padashraya, and then Bhajana Kriya he breaks into 2 stages. He says first there's Bhajaneshu Spriha. Spriha means a desire. I don't know if anybody here likes Sanskrit, but Spriha means a desire for something. And Bhajaneshu means in bhajan. So the desire to perform bhajan. And what is that desire based on? Guru Padashraya, the shelter of a guru's lotus feet. And what does this indicate? This indicates that one sits down and he hears the tattva from a guru. He gains the conceptual understanding of what the process is. Therefore, he can value it. This spriha, this desire in his heart to actually perform it, is able to come out. Then Sri Vishwanath says bhakti. So bhajana, he breaks it, bhajana kriya, he breaks into these 2 stages. And actually our acharyas, they explain that bhakti proper cannot be done until this takes place, until one takes shelter of a guru and hears from that guru about what it is. Because whatever we're doing before that, if we don't understand it, it's not truly aimed at the proper thing. And if something isn't aimed in the proper direction, then we can't necessarily call it. We can't truly call it being work for that particular goal. It's like, well, the technical way to say this is that a sadhya must have a sadhana, which means a goal defines, or a means, is defined by a goal. So if I ask any of you, like if I ask you, Yashodanandan Prabhu, I have a means. If I just tell you I have a means, the natural question you're going to say is to what? And then I say, no, there's nothing. I just have a means. And then you're going to say to what? No, it's not to, I just have a means. But that doesn't make any sense because you can't have a means without a goal. The basis of a means or a way to get to something is the something that it's directed at. So our acharyas, they actually explain that sadhana cannot exist without a properly situated sadhya, without a properly situated goal, without proper prayojana, and without the sambandha, which underpins all of the understandings of how to get to that prayojana and who we are and how we must execute that sadhana. So the Bhagavatam offers us this complete picture and offers us a system of gaining knowledge which will allow us to value what we're actually going for. So many of these details that are given, they are here to squash doubts. They're here to give us a complete picture and here to help us to be, I don't want to use that word because it's so cliched right now, but immunized out there, I used it. To be immunized from the influences of other philosophical ideals, from the influences of other things that may sway our perception or our desire to move in a particular direction. Because the world is a very, very convincing place. It's a very, very seductive place. And the world of ideas, especially in the time that we live in now, and intellectual pursuit being touted more than ever in the world, it's very, very attractive. Modern science it's very good for many things, and it's very, very attractive. So actually, we have a way to become, I don't want to use the word again, to become protected, I'll say. I'm not going to, to become protected from these influences. And that way is to become grounded in our own philosophy, to become grounded in our own worldview, and to protect the desires that we have to actually attain that thing. Many times, what we do is we do the opposite, and we say, oh, well, anyway, this is the world and this is my spiritual practice, and never shall the two meet, and I'll just somehow maintain them both. But actually, this is really an affront to what the Vedas are offering us. The Vedas are offering us a way to be completely convinced, because they're actually offering us a clear understanding of the nature of reality in a much deeper way than anyone can ever touch through any other means, through any other religious tradition, through any means of exploration by the empirical method. We have a way, and we simply have to turn our ears to that way. So this is why Shravanam is so important. And this is also what one should bear in mind when they come across detailed descriptions of seemingly technical things that don't seem to have any weight for my bhajan. Because oftentimes we give far too little credit to how much we're swayed by intelligent philosophy. And because the Bhagavatam is relegated to the pages of a book, and it may not be being spoken by extremely charismatic and influential people in this world, in reference to the people that are actually influential in this world, oftentimes we can relegate it to the back seat and then take more inspiration from other people for the practicals, we should say, of our lives. But actually the Bhagavatam, it's a reservoir of all knowledge, which can help us to move forward in all ways. And again, if we're intelligent and if we're going to be proper opportunists, because we're all opportunists to some degree, then we should understand this promise of the Bhagavatam and of our acharyas, that the Bhagavatam and Shravanam are the first place that we can actually get a taste. And that taste, again, is the fact that we get an experience off of actually having a paradigm shift. And all of us, everyone who's sitting here, anyone who's listening to this, any devotee in the world has experienced that. Why did we give up the things that we gave up, or why have we started to do the things that we've done? Because we've become convinced that they would be effective. How did we become convinced that they would be effective? Because we talked to somebody or heard from somebody or carried out a process that we were told to do. And those things created a foundation and an understanding of how we can move forward in our lives. So just a little addendum there. And now we'll move into chapter 7. So first in chapters 5 and 6, Vidura asks Maitreya about the universe. And we hear a bunch of technical stuff about how the elements unfold and all of these things go. And then in chapter 7, Vidura reveals his doubts to Maitreya. So he hears so many things, and then, like any good student, he naturally thinks, wait a second, I didn't get that. I didn't really understand what you said there, or it doesn't make any sense to me. This is actually the one that Vidura says to Maitreya. He says it very respectfully, but he says, you told me some things about the Lord, and they don't make any sense to me, particularly about how he could ever have a connection with Maya. Because in this chapter, in chapter 6, what is explained is that the Lord expands Maya, and then through her agency, the material world is controlled, and that he's doing it through her agency. And so Vidura is saying, well, I can't understand this. The Lord is supposed to be transcendental. How could he ever be connected to Maya? And he also asks about the jiva's bondage, which is another question directly related to Maya. Now, we don't have a chance to get into that here because it would take a bit of time. It's one of the big questions of our sampradaya and the big questions of Vedanta in general, how there can be the Lord, Maya, and the jiva and what their existences are. And this is actually the particular place where Achintya Bheda Veda Tattva finds its application in the most philosophical sense. Many times we throw that term around just anytime we see two things that are a little bit contradictory. And we say, well, it's Achintya Prabhu. But actually, it's a very specific term. And the main place it's used in a general way is to understand the nature of the Lord and his energies. But one of the main places it's employed is the Lord's relationship with Maya, Maya's relationship with the jiva, and the jiva's relationship with the Lord in their simultaneous oneness and difference, which ultimately After going through all of the most exhaustive philosophical understanding of it, the best explanation is that it's achintya. So after revealing his doubts like a good student, Vidura thanks Maitreya for clearing those doubts. And then Maitreya, because he sees that Vidura is actually a devotee, and he knows that he's a devotee because of his attachment to Uddhava and because he's one of the Yadus, because he has personally lived with Krishna and existed at least with Kunti Devi and with some of Krishna's family. He decides, I should speak the Bhagavatam as I've heard it. Just as Sutta Goswami, when he was asked by the rishis at the beginning of the book, the rishis headed by Shonaka all asked him the right questions. They said, what do you think is the best thing? What is the best scripture to you? And so Sutta Goswami was free to speak the thing that he actually wanted to speak. And so he decided to speak the Bhagavatam as he heard it from Shukadev Goswami. So similarly, Maitreya weighed all the options. And he spoke to Vidura the Bhagavatam as he heard it in his parampara. So first he explains the parampara, and this is the beginning of chapter 8. He explains the parampara that he heard the Bhagavatam in, which is coming, it's coming from Sanat Kumar. So the four Kumaras, they were very interested to hear about Lord Vasudev. So they went down to the bottom of the universe, taking the route of the Ganga, and they went to Lord Sankarshan, and they asked him about Lord Vasudev. And Sri Sankarshana, Sri Sankarshana told the Kumaras the story of the Bhagavatam and told them all of the different exploits that are within the Bhagavatam. And then the Kumaras, they carried that forward and they spoke it to Sankyayana Muni. And then Sankyayana Muni, who was the guru of Parashara, spoke it to Parashara and spoke it to Brihaspati. And then Parashara spoke it to Maitreya. So Maitreya is doing one thing here. He's laying out to Vidura that you don't have to worry because this is coming in a proper lineage. You know all of these people. And so you can understand that this is bona fide knowledge. And this is the great boon of Vedic literature, that we actually have a lineage. We have this concept of samanvaya. We have a concept of teachers, and we have a concept of scriptures that are not meant to be changed. And so therefore, we're able to actually have substantial and stable knowledge. So Maitreya is displaying this, and he lets Vidura know that what he's going to hear is going to be, it's bona fide. It may be radical, and it may be something new for him, but it is in a line of parampara from great souls. So then he goes on to the story. And the beginning of this story starts at the beginning of the story for the universe, which is Garbhodakshaya Vishnu entering the universe and laying down in the waters of the universe, laying there for 1,000 Chatur-yugas, and then deciding to glance upon the jivas who were merged into him. Because when the universal devastation happens, all the jivas enter into Shushupti. They enter into the body of Mahavishnu. And when they enter into the body of Mahavishnu, all of their karmas they're wound up, and they themselves are wound up. They no longer have gross bodies, and they just sit until they're reactivated, so to speak. So he glances upon the jivas after 1,000 Chatur-yugas, and the elements, when he glances, become agitated by Rajagun, by passion. And from his navel sprouts this giant lotus that's called Vairaja, which is considered one of 3 bodies of Lord Brahma, actually. According to Rupa Goswami, 2, and according to Sri Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, 3. There's the lotus, there's the universal form in itself, and then there is Brahma himself as a person. So these 3 forms. So this lotus sprouts, and it goes up and up and up, and it's a representation, not a representation, but it is the foundation of the 14 realms, the 14 lokas, which we know as the universe. And then Brahma, at the top of that lotus, is born. So when Brahma is born, he looks out and he sees nothing but darkness. Everywhere it's just dark, 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 and he hears a storm. He hears just a cacophony in the ocean of destruction, and he hears the winds of devastation. And so He's just clinging to the lotus as this great storm is raging around him, and he's wondering, what am I doing here? Who am I? What is this lotus that I'm perched upon? Where does it come from? I need answers. I need answers. And so he decides to try to trace out the lotus's origin. So he goes down through the stem of the lotus and he tries to trace the origin of it. He goes down, 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 down into the water, and he's looking for where this lotus is coming from. Now, we all know this lotus is coming from the navel of Garbhodakshaya Vishnu. But Lord Brahma is not able to find Garbhodakshaya Vishnu. He's foiled in his attempts to find the origin of that lotus. He actually looks for 100 years. Now, our acharyas comment that this can't be 100 years for Lord Brahma because his life is 100 years long by his estimation, or by time in his realm. So it means 100 years in the years of men. He searched for 100 years, and then finally he gave up, and he went back. He came back to the top of the lotus, and because there was nothing else that he could do, he sat and he meditated for another 100 years. And in that meditation, he came to a state of samadhi, because he's Lord Brahma, so he's quite good at it. He's a natural, we can say. He comes into a state of samadhi, and he sees the Lord. He sees the person who he was searching after. So now we have a nice description in about 10 verses of the Lord as he saw him. But I only want to touch on one because it's a very nice point that our acharyas bring up in relation to this, and that's from verse 26. So all of these verses give a beautiful description of the Lord as he's seen, and many, many beautiful adjectives and analogies to describe what he looked like. That he was like the Malaya hill, the great Mount Malaya, and he looked like the Malaya hill, which was covered in snakes, because there's a bunch of sandalwood on the Malaya hill. There are many sandalwood trees, and it's known that sandalwood trees are a favorite home of snakes. And so he's described as beautiful like the Malaya hill, and is covered in snakes because he's sitting upon the bed of Anantashesha. And so all the thousands of hoods of Anantashesha are covering his shoulders, and they're over his head, and it's like this big, great canopy. And so he looks just like the Malaya mountain, which is covered in snakes. This is one of the beautiful analogies that's given to describe the beautiful form of the Lord. But in verse 26, there's a very peculiar thing which our acharyas, particularly Sri Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he snatches upon. Because Sri Vishwanath is always interested in showing that Krishna is Swayam Bhagavan, as is Jiva Goswami, as are all of our acharyas, the commentators on the Bhagavatam and the Gaudiya Sampradaya. They're very interested because it's a bit of a controversial thing that Krishna is Swayam Bhagavan. So they're always looking for the places where this is elucidated clearly. So in verse 26, we have one line. Abhyarchatam kama dugangri padmam. Dugangri padmam, angri padmam. That Lord Brahma, he saw 1 foot of the Lord. Now, why did he say 1 foot? Sri Vishwanath says, why would he just say 1 foot? Why didn't he say the feet? Why didn't he say angri padal? Or angri padme? Why didn't he say the 2 lotus feet of the Lord? And Sri Vishwanath says, I can tell you why he said 1 foot. Because actually, this was the form of Shyamasundar Krishna, the cowherd boy, who Lord Brahma saw. Because he is Swayam Bhagavan, and therefore Lord Brahma, being the head of a sampradaya, he actually had the association of Swayam Bhagavan Sri Krishna, not only Garbhodakshaya Vishnu. He saw Garbhodakshaya Vishnu first, but then Krishna revealed to him his actual form. And therefore he says he showed 1 foot. And so what is the proof of this? First, he gives a logical proof. He says, because when Shyamasundar Krishna is in his Tribhanga form, and if you all can picture that, when he stands in that crooked stance with 1 foot cocked and his flute in his mouth, 1 foot has its soul facing outwards. And so this is what Sri Vishwanath seizes on. He says, this is what Lord Brahma is talking about. He saw Krishna the cowherd standing in his threefold bending form and having 1 foot propped out. So this is this Angri Padmam. And then Sri Vishwanath, because he knows his own realization, and this little thing isn't enough, he quotes 2 places. First, he quotes the Gopal Tapani Upanishad, because who can argue with the Upanishads? After passing the first half of my lifetime, when the night ended, I meditated and praised the Lord, who appeared in the dress of a cowherd boy before me. So he says, aha. And I have a quote from the Upanishads that, when Lord Brahma went through all of this, when Lord Brahma was going through this ordeal, Krishna appeared to me in the dress of a cowherd boy. Krishna appeared to him in the dress of a cowherd boy. And then Sri Vishwanath doesn't quote a particular verse, but he says you can also refer to Brahma Samhita. As we all know, it's a Gaudiya literature. Nobody else will accept it because Chaitanya Mahaprabhu found it. And nobody wants to give that credit because it's controversial for anybody in any other sampradaya. In Brahma Samhita, it's very elaborately explained that the Krishna or the God that Lord Brahma saw was Sri Krishna, who lives in Vrindavan and who is a cowherd boy. So that brings us to the conclusion of the chapter, where it's really a setup for the prayers of Lord Brahma that we're going to hear in the next chapter. So there's another point that is really nice from this section, but I kind of like to just leave a little time open. We only have 15 more minutes left. I'd like to leave a little time for any comments or thoughts or questions. I'll touch this. It'll take 3 minutes. We'll just do this. So there's another point of this section. Try. So there's another point that this section of the Bhagavatam is used to help us understand. In the Bhagavat Sandarbha, Jiva Goswami is showing without a shadow of a doubt that Krishna's form is non-material, because this is a big important argument for us, especially against people who are impersonalists. What to speak of against people who are atheistic in view, but especially for people who have an impersonal leaning. The idea that the Lord's form can be Maya. So in Bhagavat Sandarbha, he quotes Lord Brahma from the 14th chapter of the 10th canto. And I'll just read the verse. Tatschej jalastam tavasaj jagadvapu kim me nadrishtam bhagavam stadaiva kim va sudrishtam hridime tadaiva kim no sapadyeva punarvidrashi. Now, in this verse, Lord Brahma is asking 3 questions. He's saying, when I went down to look for you through the stem of the lotus, how was it that I was not able to find your form? I couldn't see it, could I? He's asking a rhetorical question because this is just after the Brahma Vimohan Leela. So Brahma has been completely bewildered, but now he's come to a realization and an understanding. His ultimate understanding is that he can't understand Krishna fully, but he's giving his understanding as far as he is possible. So he says, Kim meina drashtam bhagavam stadaiva. I couldn't see your form, which actually is the universe and which contains the universe. Even though it's supposed to be in the universe, it is jalastam, it's situated in the water, yet I couldn't see it. I was looking all over the water. I was seeing the lotus and I was seeing the water, but I could not see your form. And then he says, Kim va sudrashtam hridime tadaiva. Yet, when I went into samadhi, because we just heard he went into samadhi after being foiled in his look, in his search. When I went into samadhi, was I not able to see it? Of course I was able to see it. We had a conversation. I offered prayers to you. You showed me your form as Shyamasundar Tribhanga Krishna. Kim no sapadyeva punarvidarshi. And as soon as that trance ended, which we're going to hear about in the next chapter, that form was unavailable to me. I wasn't able to search it out again. So he's saying here, Sri Jiva Goswami glosses this and explains what Lord Brahma is saying, that Krishna's form is completely transcendental, and it's the reservoir of all contradictory ideas. It is the reservoir of all paradoxes. Because how is it possible that something can be situated within the universe and also contain the universe? Now later on, we also hear the quotes of Mother Yashoda. Jiva Goswami further expands this argument by quoting Mother Yashoda, seeing the dirt within Krishna's mouth, seeing the universes within Krishna's mouth. He quotes her trying to tie him up, and the fact that he is untieable because something has to have a beginning and an end. But Krishna is all-pervading, so he doesn't have a beginning or an end. So nothing can be contained if it doesn't have any limit, because in order for something to be contained within something like a rope, it has to have limits, because something has to go around it. Yet, he is actually bound. So this idea that he can have a limited form and an unlimited form is what Lord Brahma is pointing out here. And also that form is not material, because if it was material, he would have been able to see it when he searched for it. And if it was spiritual, or if it was material, he wouldn't have been able to see it in samadhi, because it's said very clearly here that he was in a perfect trance of samadhi. There was no possibility in that trance for there to be anything material. And yet he saw the form of the Lord. And then as a confirmation, he wasn't able to see it again outside of the trance. He wasn't able to find it. He wasn't able to trace it out. So it's a little bit technical. But again, this is Shastra Pramanam. We're talking about the Vedas. And if we're talking to somebody, we shouldn't be interested in arguments that aren't coming from the Vedas. And if somebody tries to bring some argument from the Vedas and seems very convincing, we should say, well, you have to tend with the Pramanam from the Bhagavatam. Because what is the Bhagavatam? The Bhagavatam is the opinion of the person who wrote down all the Vedas. The Bhagavatam is the highest opinion of Vyasadeva in his highest state of revelation. So nobody has to argue with you. They have to argue with Vyasadeva. We simply have to come and pick up the arguments and understand them, even at a surface level. And again, we should understand that this offers us a great ability to have some security in our spiritual lives, to have some security in our want to go towards the goal. Because otherwise, what are we other than at the mercy of somebody who can speak charismatically? That's how this world works. That's how this world is degrading. Because somebody comes along and they're able to present something in a way that sounds appealing. And what can we do? We don't have access to the empowerment. We don't have access to a way to be able to see through that. And we can only say, well, sounds good. I guess I'm going to go with that. And we're left with our own mental thoughts and our own ideas about what it could be, when really we're being given a revolutionary amount of empowerment. And this I really appreciate, the last thing I'll say, because I think, and this is my own thought, so take it with a grain of salt. I think Srila Prabhupada saw this because actually previously, it wasn't so common to see people other than Brahmanas, people other than very, very advanced people taking to even having an understanding of Shastra in a deep way. Society was set up such that people could just kind of go through their lives. But Srila Prabhupada saw the necessity for this, and he saw that actually this will help create the foundation of a proper society and a foundation for people to actually have a fighting chance at moving towards spiritual life, because this is very empowering. When you understand the tenets of a philosophy, then you are able to come to the table and speak about it. You're able to understand if what people are telling you is valid or not valid in an impartial way, not in a way that is demeaning their character or anything like that. And you're also able to develop in a way that can help you move towards the absolute truth. Shri Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, I'll stop with this and then we can have a little bit of back and forth if anybody has anything. Shri Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says that lovers of the truth, they have discussions for the sake of finding the truth. And this is what we should all be trying to do. This is an integral aspect of sadhu sangha, and an integral second step to shravanam is integrating that shravanam. This is also kirtanam. Tushanti cha ramanti cha bodhayantas parasparam. Amongst one another, we should be speaking about this stuff. We should be speaking about this philosophy. We should be saying, Prabhu, do you think I have this right? Do you think that is this clear? Does it make sense to you? What is your thought about this? Because by doing this, by doing these little things, by sharpening ourselves, we're able to actually practice bhakti nicely. And this is very powerful. And it's a shame if we relegate it to the dustbin because we think it's just not my nature. Because actually, it's a requirement. Srila Rupa Goswami says in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, there are 3 adhikars, Kanishta adhikar, Madhyam adhikar, and Uttam adhikar. And he's not talking about spiritual realization. He's very clear. He's talking about levels of faith, which means shastric knowledge. The Uttam adhikari, he is able to convince anyone because he understands very clearly the Siddhanta. The Madhyam adhikari, he understands enough that he has very strong faith and he has not yet put enough work in to be able to be convincing in all circumstances. But he's safe because he's hearing from people who can. And the Kanishta adhikari, he has komala shraddha. He has very weak faith. Therefore, if somebody with some charisma, somebody who can juggle some words comes into the room, he'll think, oh, maybe he's right. Maybe this is true. We don't want to find ourselves in this position. We don't want to pretend that we're Kanishtadikaris forever. We should be really struggling to get off of that platform. And it doesn't mean spiritual realization. According to Rupa Goswami, it means a very simple thing. It means understanding the philosophy. And by doing that, again, we're able to have something very attractive to us, a paradigm shift, which then allows us to actually want to move forward because we can value the thing. That's really the ultimate takeaway that I have for this, and something that's it's become an imperative focus in my life. If I'm not doing bhakti nicely, which most of the time I'm not pointing this at any one of you. If I'm not doing bhakti very nicely, it means I don't understand it enough to see why I should value it. Therefore, I have to put the work in to be able to value it. Vasudeva Kata Ruchi, the first place we're going to get taste is from hearing the kata of the exploits of Sri Vasudeva, of Sri Krishna. So I'll stop there. If there are any comments, corrections, thoughts, I'd love to hear some. And I thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much, Ujjvala Prabhu. For the viewers online, I included a link as well to the verse that Ujjvala Prabhu mentioned. I had two questions and also an appreciation for that thing that you just said. If I'm not doing bhakti nicely, it means I'm not understanding it properly enough to value it. Something like that. I couldn't get the exact words, but I really loved how you put that, and it definitely resonated. So thank you for that, sharing that realization. Also, two questions. The first one, when you're talking about the need to understand these finer points, it's like understanding a law book. And so your perspective, since you study scripture a lot and just knowing you tend to do it very systematically, at least is my impression. So what would you recommend for us as a general Sunday feast audience on how to systematically approach topics like this to gradually appreciate these finer, more technical points, and not just from like the mechanical aspect of it, of like understanding this, but in a way that it enhances our bhakti?
Well, the first thing, there are two things, and it's hard to pin down which one is first. So I'll just say two things. One is to make it a priority to read something regularly. Often it's easy to get swept into, and even me living in the ashram, I can honestly say I went 3 years in the ashram, and because things were so difficult in those that particular period of my life in the ashram, because things were so difficult and I had so many responsibilities, I found myself going months without reading. And the culture being just fine with that because I was absorbed. I was trying to do, not absorbed in a Krishna conscious way, but I was absorbed in what I was doing. So we need to find, first we have to, the integral understanding is that this is going to be the thing that helps me move forward leaps and bounds if I do it. And then realizing that that just means doing it regularly. It doesn't mean doing it intensely or extremely or 3 hours a day or even 1 hour a day or even 30 minutes a day, though those things are good. But at least regularly coming in touch with the Shastra. The second thing, which in my experience is more potent and usually fuels us having the ability to get into the first one that I said, is hearing from someone who already understands them. I have a funny story to tell you in light of that, and it highlights the necessity of a teacher so much, and it's really hilarious. So my friend plays saxophone. He's actually practicing it right now. I can hear it. And the other day he came into my room because we were going to read together, and he was really not happy. He's extremely flustered. And so I said, Abai, what's the problem? And he goes, man, you're not going to believe it if I tell you. You're not going to. I said, what's the problem? He said, I've been playing saxophone for a whole year. I've been playing saxophone for a year. And the other day, this little white thing fell out of the saxophone, and I thought, oh no, it's broken. What's going on with this? And so the next day, he picked it up because he didn't mess with it. He didn't want to break it more. And he was fiddling with it, and another one of the white things fell out. And he was like, what the hell? What is this? You know, this is practically new. I've treated it like gold. And all of a sudden he realized these were little stoppers in the saxophone. And he recounted this to me vividly. He said when he was given the saxophone, there was a devotee girl in Radhadesh, because that's where he was, who knew how to play saxophone. And he thought, I'll approach her. and I'll just ask her for some tips real quick. But then he had the thought, I don't need to do that. And he told me he wanted the credit of learning it on his own. These were noise blockers that were meant to stop dust from getting into the saxophone. And so for a year, he was watching YouTube videos and wondering, why are they able to get that particular sound? Because he was able to get some sounds out of it because some of the blockers were already gone. And he was wondering, like, is it a way that they're blowing? How is it that they're able to get that low tone out of the saxophone? Why can't I do it? And it took him a whole year to realize he didn't take the stoppers out of some parts of it. When if he had just come to an expert, or at least somebody who knew something, and said, hey, can you tell me about this? They would have looked at his saxophone, maybe played a little bit. Oh, what's this? It's not working right. Oh, there's stoppers in here. And he would have been set from the get-go. So it's very important that we hear from somebody who already has some understanding, because understanding can be given very clearly when somebody speaks from a point of realization. And I don't mean spiritual realization, though that's even better. But somebody who has clarity on a subject is able to talk about it in a way that it clicks. Because if you're expert at something, you should be able to explain it in a way that a 5-year-old can get it, even if it's a very difficult topic. And I think that's the most powerful thing, because that's where we really get juice. And I think that's really the way it works. We get attracted to something because somebody is able to speak it nicely. So those are my answers to those.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Other question is, so Lord Brahma meditated for roughly 200 years and got darshan of Krishna. And so earlier in your talk, you mentioned about the importance of having clarity of the goal. And this seems like a nice example of your point. So could you just elaborate a little bit on your understanding of what Lord Brahma's goal was? Was it purely his desire to understand his surroundings and kind of his situation? Because at least for me, superficially, that sounds a little vague. But when he was able to get darshan after 200 years, which is a relatively short period, like that implies that there was something seriously focused there.
Yes. So one thing we have to understand is Lord Brahma is a guna avatar. So he has a specific purpose. And because of that, his goal, it says very clearly in this chapter, his goal was to be able to facilitate his service of creation. And Lord Vasudev, because he's already a devotee, he facilitated that and came into his consciousness, even though he was meditating on that, because ultimately it was service. It was his desire to be able to do something, which is ultimately the desire of Vishnu. We hear about this. Where was it? I was just going over this previously. We hear about this. This is in Paramatma Sandarbha, actually, that the entirety of the universe is manifested so that the Lord's devotees are able to have a chance to do their bhajan more, which is a very cool point. We won't go deep into that. But the manifestation of the world is the desire of Vishnu to give the jivas the abilities to live out their karmas and facilitate their desires, and more importantly, to allow those who are still sadhakas to continue doing their bhajan. So Brahma is carrying out, that's where I was reading it, because we're doing Priyavrata right now here in the Priyavrata Leela in the 5th canto. And Priyavrata, he doesn't want to give up the kingdom, or he doesn't want to give up meditation and take up the kingdom. But Lord Brahma comes to him and says, my boy, you have to understand, I'm working for Vishnu and we need you to work for Vishnu. You say you're a devotee, you want to do something for Krishna, for Vishnu, then you need to take up this kingship and become a Manu for some period. So Lord Brahma, he's also doing this thing which is directly to the desire of the Lord. Therefore, he gets this special mercy because he's a very special person and this has to go on. So that's why it seems a little vague and why he just feels like, oh, I just want to do the creation. He has some sense of his duty, but he doesn't know how to do it. And then we're going to hear more of an exposition of that in the next chapter about his desires, his fears, his necessity for empowerment, and all of that. That's my understanding.
Awesome transition. I don't see any other questions in the chat on Zoom or YouTube. So if you want to just use this if there's a final takeaway message that you would like to give, otherwise we'll conclude.
Okay, yeah, I think that's good. I just like to say thank you again for everybody for being here and for Yashodanandan Prabhu for inviting me and you all tolerating me for an hour. I hope that there could have been something there that's nice. I tried to speak from something or speak about something that I hold very dear to me because it's been very effective in my life. And I figure at least if I speak from that, maybe there's some hope of it cutting through because let's face it, I'm not such a big devotee. So I don't expect anybody to have like a whoa moment from whatever I say, but I think this is very powerful because it's very practical. If we understand the basis of why we should study and why we should understand these things, or at least hear, maybe not study, the basis of it is that this is going to be able to fuel our desire to do the practice in the first place, because we'll be able to value it. As you reflected, if we don't know something, we can't value it. If we don't value something, we're never going to go after it. So it really starts with a conceptual orientation that is conducive to bhakti yoga and conducive to actually wanting to attain Krishna. Do I know who Krishna is? I should ask myself every day. Because if I knew who Krishna was, then there would be no question of wanting to attain him. And there are so many stories, we don't have time, but so many beautiful stories we can hear about Krishna's heart and his nature. So we have to just use these things and actually hear about him a little bit. And then by hearing about him the right way, then we can actually want to attain him and his service and the Sangha of his devotees. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Hare Krishna.
Jai Ho.
Thank you, everyone. This concludes our Sunday Feast program. So many thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. And next week, we will continue with this Brilliant as the Sun series. And the talk will be given by His Grace Ikshvaku